This is Jim Hughes from AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded presentations by retired senior intelligence officers who have great stories to tell. Today, I'm inviting back our very first guest presenter. You'll recall Joe Augustyn. He's a retired senior clandestine service officer, served primarily in CIA's Natural Resources Division and Near East Division. Before he retired, he was deputy chief of our East Asia Division. But most important for today's program, he was the director of our Defector Resettlement Program. Joe, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for inviting me back, and particularly to talk about this subject, which I really find to be fascinating. And I think it's a program that is not well known even within CIA. And so I hope your viewers today get an opportunity to hear a little bit about the inside view of the CIA's Defector Resettlement Program. So just by way of a little history here, this program, the Defector Resettlement Program, it has been in existence really since 1949, the 1949 CIA Act, which is also called Public Law 110. And Public Law 110, again, going back to 1949, allows the U.S. intelligence community, and specifically the CIA, to bring into this country for resettlement purposes up to 100 people a year. These are people who have contributed substantially and provided exceptional service overseas on behalf of the U.S. government and helping protect our and enhancing our own security. These people are considered defectors. Now, you know, when we all go through training in the clandestine service, we have a mantra. We all hear, and you've all heard, and your viewers, I'm sure, have all heard the idea of spot, assess, develop, and recruit. That's great. But there are a number of cases where we have recruited assets overseas who we add yet a fifth word to that mantra, and that's resettle. Now, we would rather have our recruited assets stay and work in place. We don't look for defectors, okay? But there are times when defectors, through no fault of their own, sometimes through their own fault, become subject to scrutiny by their host service. They make a mistake. Occasionally, CIA makes a mistake. And then we have to think about what to do with these assets, these valuable assets. And so I think CIA Defector Resettlement Program is reflective of the fact that we take care of our assets. Okay, there are many of these people over years, and I can tell you that, you know, that we bring in, we have a limit of 100. We very rarely reach that limit, but we bring in a number of people each year to protect them because they've been, they've gotten in trouble overseas, and it's for the best for them and their family to bring them in and to become part of the Defector Resettlement Program. Now, we do this for Russians, of course, which most of whom, who mostly get the attention, but we also do this for Chinese, North Koreans, Iranians, any defector, any recruited asset who is in trouble, and we have to bring them in and resettle them. And we resettle these people actually for the rest of their lives. And so I can tell you, and I'm allowed to tell you, that currently the CIA has several hundred of these resettlees currently living in the United States. Could be your neighbors, could be your next door neighbor, and we take care of them for the rest of their lives. So this is a program, again, that goes back to 1949. And it was the foresight of the founders of the CIA who decided back then that it was incredibly important to protect and to provide for the security of those people, and who provided this kind of information and substantial contribution to U.S. security. Now, we don't take in everyone who defects, and we don't have this resettlement program does not exist for everyone, but it exists for those who have provided that kind of substantial contribution.
Joe, is this like the U.S. Marshals Witness Protection Program? How do the two programs differ?
Oftentimes the CIA resettlement program is compared to the U.S. Marshals Service, and in some ways they are similar. In other ways, they're dramatically different. For example, most of the people in the U.S. Marshals Service Witness Protection Program are U.S. citizens. They're accustomed to living in the United States. They're usually involved in crime issues, or they've been witnesses in crime cases, criminal cases, drug cases, and for whatever reason, they need protection by the U.S. Marshal Service. So in some ways, it's similar. Where it differs dramatically is that if you're part of the U.S. Marshal Service Witness Protection Program, you abide by very specific rules. And there are many cases where people in that program are basically kicked out of the program because they don't abide by the very strict rules. When CIA takes in a resettlement case, and we are providing for the care and feeding of our defectors, we're doing this for life, okay? Once you're in the program, you're never out of the program. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort because this is what we do. We look after our people, and we look after our people for the lifetime of, and by the way, this includes family members as well. So that's the primary difference between the two programs.
Joe, can you discuss a typical case and perhaps tell us what a defector and his or her family go through when they're being resettled to the United States? And what have you learned about a typical defector's frame of mind and the reasons for them defecting in the first place?
Jim, as you know, in our CIA careers, we have many. It seems like we have many positions as we spend our career in the agency. I spent 28 years in CIA and had many different assignments. And I can tell you, this assignment, and I was chief of station on a couple of occasions, and I had senior positions, and as you said, in area divisions. But I found this position to be extremely interesting because I made it a point to meet almost, I wouldn't say every defector under my charge at the time, but I've spent countless hours with some of the agency's crown jewels in terms of intelligence assets. I had the great opportunity to meet with Yuri Nosenko, for example. I've met personally with Rashid Kuklinski. And these are names I can mention. I met routinely for lunch with Alexander Zaporozhsky. These are people who are publicly known now, but I spent a great deal of time with these people and found it incredibly interesting to delve into what makes a defector, what makes a person do what they do. And what I've concluded is that really, people who spy against their country are really not what we would call normal. I would like to think that, you and me and others in the agency and the rest of the population would never think about doing that. So those people who do are really not in the area that we would call normal. Now, what I found with most defectors is that most of them are A-plus personalities, okay? Most of them are egotists, I should say. Many are risk takers. And if you think about it, they wouldn't do what they had done for us unless they fall into that category. Now, it's a matter of what is it what does it take? And let me tell you why it's difficult to resettle some of these people who we have to bring out because they're in trouble. Now, we've done this, and the exfiltrations, as we call it, have happened in a wide variety of ways. Sometimes defectors get out on their own, and we take them in and help them through the resettlement process. Other times, we've taken out defectors in trunks of cars, like you see in the movies, or we take them out under the darkness of night. And what happens in a typical case? Again, these are people who now are in jeopardy. Their host service is onto them. They need to get out, and they need a safe haven. And this is and they look to us to do this. And we don't give up on our defectors, and we don't give up on our recruited assets. If there's someone who needs this kind of help, we're going to help. So why does it get difficult? It gets difficult because oftentimes the recruited asset hasn't discussed his or her activity with their spouse or with their family. And at some particular point in time, we say to that family and to that recruited asset, it's time for you to leave. You're in trouble. Your security is jeopardized, and we need to bring you into the United States. So we do that. So now we have, before we even initiate the program, we generally have a conflict between the recruited asset and his family. Now, and again, part of Public Law 110 allows us to take out up to 100 people a year, which includes family members. We rarely meet that threshold, but, we bring the entire family out. So now we're telling, let's say, the wife and the 2 kids or 3 kids or whatever it is, now they're coming to the United States. Again, often in a very rushed fashion. And they arrive in the United States, and we say, let's take a Russian, for example. Now you speak Russian, but now we're going to teach you English. Okay? And now we're going to assimilate you into U.S. society. Oftentimes, they're unfamiliar with the language. We're going to put the kids in a new school. And by the way, most of the recruited assets, when I mentioned about their personalities and the fact that, we only recruit, or we generally recruit overseas, those people who are important figures in science, in the science world. Perhaps they're government officials. Perhaps they're military officials, perhaps they're intelligence officials, and these are generally our recruitment targets. So we're taking them out of the country, we're bringing them into the United States, and we say to the recruited asset, by the way, the job you held back in Russia or China or North Korea, which was really important, is really not the kind of job you're going to have in the United States. There's a sense of euphoria when they first get to the United States, at least for the recruited asset, because it's new to them, it's exciting. And now the process is, let's get them inculcated, let's get them assimilated into U.S. society. So we say, we're going to teach you English, we're going to put the kids in school, we're going to try to find you the kind of job that will be satisfying, but probably not at the same level you had before. And then we say, by the way, we're going to give you a new name, right? So we're going to give you a new name, and you're no longer whoever. You're now John Smith, and here's the kicker. And we say, and you cannot have any social media contact with anyone back in your host country. That means no Facebook, no Instagram, no contact with your relatives, your mothers, your grandparents, your friends, because by doing that, you risk your own security. Because the host countries generally don't give up on trying to re-find those people who are resettled into the United States. So you can see it's a traumatic experience for these people. And I can tell you that we do our best to make it easy, But after the euphoria is over, and after this happens, and all of these new elements are now part of your existence, it becomes a very difficult process for a lot of these now defector resettled families. Okay, on our staff, we had in the defector program, we had lawyers, we had psychologists, we had medical people to help these people understand and assimilate. And then after we do all of that, and after we talk to them to pick their brains more about what they knew, and that's over, then we say, and now we're probably going to resettle you in a place maybe you haven't heard of before. Maybe Florida, maybe Michigan. We ask them. We want to do what's best for them. We want them to feel comfortable, but they're going to wind up generally in a place that they don't know about. And we say to them, live happily ever after. It doesn't always work that way. And it's our job and our responsibility and the CIA's responsibility from an ethical and moral standpoint to do our best to make that process easy. Because if we don't make it easy, and if we don't do the right thing, we won't get the kind of recruited assets interested in doing what we ask them to do.
Joe, without revealing any classified material, can you discuss any specific cases that you or the officers with you handled? Any problems that you encountered with the defector community? Were there any unhappy defectors? And have any of them publicly criticized CIA as a result?
Yes, when I took the job as the director of the resettlement program, I remember George Tenet, who was the director at the time, telling me, "I don't want to hear from you." Well, because no news is good news from the defector program. And I remember, speaking to many congressional leaders. I was called on up to the Hill on a number of occasions to talk about resettlement issues, and so there are issues that come up. As I said, the sense of euphoria that most of the defectors experience when they first get here tends to wane over the years, and it's up to us. That is CIA and the defector program to make sure that not only are these people happy, but that they're safe. And so there's a great deal of attention paid to veiled threats that we see come across our screen, or the fact that some of these people may be on Vladimir Putin's target list, for example. So we have to be very careful of that. But to your question, there are people like Colonel Kuklinski, who was probably one of the most important spies during the Cold War. He a Polish colonel who worked with us for 9 years until about 1981, from about 1972 to 1981 or so. He provided over 35,000 pages of documents on Soviet Warsaw Pact activity. And by the way, this is all public knowledge. Kuklinski's been written about extensively. Our case officers in Warsaw met with Kuklinski over this period approximately 63 times clandestinely. He was a rock star. In the sense of a recruited asset. Well, right before the imposition of martial law in Poland in 1981, he became under suspicion. His host service, the Polish government, began to think, who is this guy? And at that point, we decided, with his August concurrence, to bring him into the United States and resettle him here. Again, I had the opportunity to meet with him numerous times over lunches and over dinners and conversations. He was a remarkable asset in the sense, and a remarkable man, a brave man who risked everything to help the United States. Now, was his resettlement successful? You know, he lived comfortably. By the way, we give our people who we take into this program, we give them an annuity. We give them we help them with housing and that kind of thing. And Kuklinski lived a relatively happy life, but he's a personality that was always on the go. He was a personality that wanted more, that wanted to do things. He no longer was the colonel who was providing incredibly important intel to the United States. So he lived comfortably in a southern state with his wife and 2 kids. And, you know, were there problems with Kuklinski? You know, it is, because it was a come down from what he had been doing for years and years in a very important position in Poland. Now, tragically, and this is still subject to debate, and historians look at it. Tragically, both of his kids, who were teenagers, died mysteriously. One was went out with a friend sailing off the coast of Florida on a very calm day with very calm seas, and was lost at sea and died mysteriously. 6 months later, within 6 months, his second son was hit and killed in a hit and run accident where the hit and run driver was never found, and the car in which Kuklinski's son died was burned to a crisp. Now, the question is, what happened? You know, and so this happened. Kuklinski died, by the way, in 2004. And these tragic losses of his son happened prior to his death. So that was traumatic and still, you know, shrouded in mystery in terms of what really happened to Kuklinski. I've had the opportunity, like I said, to meet with Yuri Nusenko, very famous and well-known spy who there was a lot of questions about whether or not he was an actual defector. But, you know, he lived a good life. We provided for him very well. And his existence in the United States, I would say, was a good one and a very rewarding one for him. Then there's Alexander Zaporozhsky. Alexander Zaporozhsky was a KGB colonel who did a lot of work in Africa and in Latin America, and actually wound up, after the fall of the Soviet Union, working with our CIA station overseas. He was a recruited asset, and he was responsible, or at least he led our very professional and very detailed counterintelligence officers to discover Aldrich Ames. He gave us a tip. He didn't give us the name of Aldrich Ames because he didn't know it, but he gave us a tip in terms that helped lead the investigation toward the eventual fingering of Aldrich Ames. Now, he came to the United States, and he came also with his wife and 2 children, and led a very successful life for a while. But again, the defectors that I'm familiar with and the ones I've met have a personality that we would consider an A-type personality. Well, somewhere after being in the United States for a number of years, and I met with him almost weekly for lunch, he was lured back into Russia. I remember meeting with him and sitting with him for lunch and he said to me, and he was one of these stereotypical, right out of central casting colonels saying, I'm going back to meet with friends. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is that we can't control what our defectors want to do. If they want to leave the program, they can leave. If they want to go back, we can dissuade them, we can strongly suggest that they don't, but it's really up to them. Zaporozhye decided to go back and meet with friends because he was told he would be safe and that he could pull this off. Well, I remember having lunch with him and saying to him at one point, Alex, you can't go back because if you do, I'll never see you again. We've got a few other, very senior agency people to suggest the same thing. Well, he decided to go back. And when he landed in Moscow, he was arrested by the FSB and sentenced to 18 years of hard labor. Interesting story about him, and this is why this has become public. It's because he was arrested in the year 2000, sentenced to 18 years of hard labor, like I said. And this is where the agency doesn't forget about its key assets and its crown jewels. He was also part of the 2010 spy swap, where we had Anna Chapman and those people, the illegals that we discovered in 2010, and we traded them for four of our four assets that were in prison or in hard labor in Russia, one of whom was Zaporozhye. We brought Zaporozhye back. The other famous one within that, we gave them 10. We got back 4, one of whom was Sergei Skripal, the defector who was poisoned in Salisbury with his daughter in March of 2018. Anyway, Zaporozhye came back. We got him back. We don't forget our people. We got him back, but by the time he returned, his wife had passed away. His existence, he was kind of a shadow of his own self. But another example of the fact that two things, that these defectors have minds of their own, and the fact that we still, despite what happened, tried to take or did take care of them. Now, in terms of whether we have unhappy defectors, it happens. And we try our best, but like I said, the euphoria tends to subside the longer a defector is here in the United States. And there have been cases where defectors have gone to their congressman, complained about CIA treatment. Most of the time, we like to pride ourselves on making sure that we do things equitably and fairly. But there are times when I, as the director, wound up in front of a senator, letting him hear our side of the story. And one of the most famous cases that I'd like to just briefly mention is a case of a defector who came to the United States in early 90s. We provided very well for his family, but he lost his job. And frankly, did some things that with money and a lifestyle that we didn't condone. Anyway, he complained about the fact that he lost his position and challenged an interesting court case that goes back to 1876. He challenged that court case. Let me very briefly, because I think this is interesting. In 1876, or during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln hired a man named William Lloyd to spy against the Confederacy for the Union. William Lloyd died, and the executor of his estate, a man named Enoch Totten, tried to sue the U.S. government for reneging on payments that were due his client, William Lloyd, to the tune of about $10,000. Well, the Supreme Court in 1876 decided that you could not sue the government over an agreement that was reached in secret with the U.S. government. In other words, you can't sue the government if you enter into a secret agreement with the U.S. government. Well, getting back, fast forwarding now to 2002, this disgruntled defector challenged the Cotton Agreement in a case known as John and Jane Doe versus Tenet. This particular case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court withheld the 1876 Cotton Doctrine. So we do get challenges, right? We do get challenges, and we try to appease, and we try to help, and we try to counsel these people. But again, nobody defects because they're happy in their own country. We bring them here, we try to make them happy, and it doesn't always work. But we'll never give up on them, and that's key.
Joe, shifting gears just slightly, what are the qualities that make for a successful resettlement case officer?
Good question. To be a good resettlement case officer, we call them RCOs, resettlement case officers, takes a great deal of understanding, of patience. When you're in the field and you're recruiting assets, you yourself have a sense of adrenaline flowing as you try to spot, assess, develop, and recruit someone. We do that actively and we do that professionally and with great results. When these people are here, it takes a different kind of approach to these assets. We understand how valuable they were, how important they were, the kind of information they provided is important. And now we have to assert a different kind of attitude in helping these people. I always used to say you have to be a good case officer because you have to understand what they went through. They were case officers in some degree. In many cases, you have to understand what it means to be a case officer. But it's more than that as a resettlement case officer. You have to be a psychologist. You have to be a social worker. You have to be a friend. As I said, we take these cases on for life. So we're constantly, talking to them about their life, their goals, their ambitions, their family life. And so it takes a broad, personality with kind of a soft shoulder in many ways to be a good resettlement case officer. That said, you have to be tough as well. You have to tell them what they need to do. CIA, once we take them in and we're doing what we can, is not the panacea for them. It's not it's not someone who's going to take care of all of their problems. So you do your best to help them develop an independent life and a life that is worthwhile for the rest of their lives.
Joe, we've particularly recently seen and heard a lot about attacks on defectors, particularly Russian defectors in Europe. Been some spectacular cases where they've been attacked primarily, I think, by the Russians. Some seriously injured, others killed. Have we been successful in protecting our defectors here in the United States?
Yes, good. That's a very good question. Actually, that a huge part of our charter when we take in resettlement cases is to make sure, as I said, they not only live good lives, but they lead safe lives. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, and it primarily relates, as you said, to the Russians, is that somebody like Vladimir Putin is very revengeful. We saw Alexander Litvinenko, a former KGB and critic of Putin, who was poisoned while drinking tea in London in 2008, drinking tea, 2006, drinking tea spiced, laced with polonium-201. He died. In March of 2018, we've seen as I mentioned, Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, poisoned with a Russian nerve agent, Novichok. Putin and others, Putin, in this case, Putin specifically, is not only revengeful, but he has a great deal of disdain for anyone who, any traitor, as he would call them. And it's not unlike him, or it's almost to be expected that at some particular point in time, he may, in fact, put them on some kind of target list. Now, in the United States, as far as I know, we've been either fortunate or diligent and vigilant enough not to have that happen on our soil. Have there been close calls? I recall a few close calls. We once found a explosive device under a car of one of our defectors that didn't explode. And we're not absolutely sure whether it was just a sign or whether it was just a faulty explosive device. And we haven't seen what Europe has seen in terms of the the vengeful activity against some of these Russian defectors. A few years ago, the FBI did discover that 2 Russian agents had come to the United States with legal visas and were found on the street of a Russian defector and another Russian, actually GRU agent, on another street of the family of this Russian defector. And so, I think we've had some close calls, and it's important that we never give up the vigilance that's necessary to make sure these people live good lives. In June of 2017, you may remember that we had a defector whose name is Oleg Smolenkov, who was outed by a news outlet as being a Russian agent defector living in true name someplace in suburban Virginia. I've seen that. You've read that. The world has read about him. He was resettled in true name. And since that outing, he's been resettled, moved, and probably have a new name, although I'm unfamiliar with the details of that particular case. But, most of these people, and you can look at people like, Oleg, you can look at people like Oleg Gordievsky, who was recruited by MI6. And by the way, our defector program is not the only one in the world, right? I mean, the Brits have their own defector resettlement program. So do the Israelis. So do the Australians. And people like Oleg Gordievsky, Sergei Skripal, our defectors in this country, while they live decent lives, there's always something in the back of their minds, always something that they're thinking about and that we're thinking about that may cause them to have concern about their own safety and security. And again, specifically to answer your question, we have not had the kind of activity, the revengeful kind of activity, as far as I know, of hostile intel services or governments looking at our defectors. So we've been good, and maybe we've been lucky, but we haven't seen the same kind of activity we've seen in other parts of the world.
Joe, implicit in your response is the fact that there must be close cooperation with the Bureau in this area, as there is in so many others. I have to assume that the Bureau has some level of knowledge about these defectors and their identities and locations so that they can help protect them as well.
Sure. Yes, and this is very important. I mean, and one of the things I didn't mention is that the Defector Resettlement Program that is housed in CIA and run by CIA is really a community resettlement service, if you will. That means that in my tenure, and I'm sure since my tenure, we've helped resettle agents, and we've helped resettle assets that for the Bureau. We've done it for a few other agencies as well, because we like to think that we house the area specific expertise that allows us to do it, in a very good, equitable, but in a cooperative way with the FBI and other U.S. agencies as necessary and or appropriate. Now, we talk a great deal with the FBI about certain cases, but it's really our responsibility, and we've enjoyed a very good and information sharing relationship with the FBI, and in fact, we've done the same overseas. Some of our overseas allies who also have similar programs to ours.
Well, once again, a fascinating story and very well told. I want to thank Joe Augustyn, all of the officers who served with him in the Defector Resettlement Program, for doing such a great job and for bringing this amazing story to our viewers. Joe, thanks very much. It was great having you on the program again.
Thank you, Jim. My pleasure.